to the Thought Snob Podcast. I'm Paula Swope. Let's get snobby. Today, I'm here with Naomi Berger. She goes by Naomi. Naomi is a psychotherapist who helps couples and others create fulfilling relationships. She has written several books, but the one we're going to focus on today is this one, The Bipolar Therapist, A Journey from Madness to Love and Meaning. Naomi wrote this memoir after decades of keeping her struggle with bipolar disorder a secret. Now, I invited her on the show because she wants people with mental illness to know that they are not alone. And she wants to make her story readily available to their family members, therapists, friends, and others who are close to them. Naomi, welcome to the show. I absolutely cannot wait to have this conversation with you. Your story is one that must be heard, and I know that this discussion we're about to have is going to help a lot of people, and I'm going to tell you why I say that. I'm from a rural poverty pocket in Kentucky, and I don't know how familiar you are with the Appalachian culture, but mental health was absolutely absent from conversations when I was growing up. Completely. Nobody mentioned it. People who behaved oddly were basically just written off as crazy, and really they were treated like social outcasts. And my great-grandmother was one of those people, and I don't think she was shown any compassion really whatsoever. And I know that she never received an accurate diagnosis. And after hearing horror story after horror story about her, I just became very curious and intrigued by mental illness. And throughout my lifetime, I have been close with 3 people who were diagnosed with bipolar disorder, and they all had very similar characteristics. And being in relationships with them was it was difficult, almost unbearable at times. And so that led me to research bipolar disorder. I was desperate to make sense of their behaviors, and I learned a lot, but I have never talked to a medical professional about this until right now. And what's even more mind-blowing is that you are a professional therapist who is bipolar, and you didn't find that out until you were already a therapist. With all of that said, the question I want to dig into first is, when did you know that something wasn't quite right? I mean, do you remember how you felt?
It's still vivid in my mind, even though this happened decades ago. Of course, when it first happened, when you're having a manic episode, which was my kind of bipolar, I had some manic episodes that landed me in psychiatric wards. But the first thing that you experience is that everything is fine. You're on top of the world. You have, for me anyway, I have special powers. I could heal people by looking at them. And I could just sense that everybody whose path crossed mine needed some kind of healing. And it went on and on. There was a lot more to it than that. But the first time I accepted that there was really something wrong with me, I wasn't just under some kind of stress, was when I was hospitalized for the 3rd time in a year and a half. When I was hospitalized the first time, I wasn't given a diagnosis. When I was hospitalized the 2nd time, a year later, I was told I was bipolar. It was called manic depression back then. And the psychologist there gave me a test and told me that it was certain that I was manic depressive, AKA bipolar, and that I should take lithium or my career would be ruined. I did not believe him. I thought it was stress. This is all explained in my book in great detail. Mm-hmm. It's in the Bipolar Therapist. And then 6 months later, I went back to work. I was functioning at work. I was doing well at work, although I also experienced the horrendous kind of treatment that an outcast gets from my colleagues who were mental health professionals and some people were counselors that were recovering alcoholic. I worked in an alcoholism treatment center. And 6 months later, after my second hospitalization, I started taking lithium. And I did so at the urging of the psychiatrist who was working on the ward and some dear friends of mine who spoke to him and then urged me to take lithium. So I suppose you could say that I accepted something was wrong with me by then because I was willing to take the medication.
So I haven't read your book from cover to cover, but I have read quite a bit of it. And so your diagnosis was in the 70s, mid 70s?
Yes.
Okay. And so then it was more referred to as manic depression and not bipolar, right?
Right.
Okay. Okay. So,
Yes. I have a footnote in the book. I can't remember exactly what year, but somewhere around 1982, they started calling it bipolar.
okay. Well, before we go any further, will you, because I don't want to assume that our listeners have information that they don't have, and I also need some clarity as well. Would you explain what bipolar disorder is? And I would like to know the difference between bipolar 1 and bipolar 2.
Yes. Okay. So the characteristic of bipolar disorder, for the cases where the word bipolar implies that there are two things that happen to you. You have extreme ups, high kinds of moods, and very low or depressed moods, and it can alternate rapidly from one to the other, even the same day, from feeling very high to feeling very low, or it could be longer, several days or longer of mania. That's the feeling high.
Mm-hmm.
And then later depression for a while. Bipolar 1, which is probably what I was experiencing, more the manic. I did not have the kind of depressions that would land me in a mental hospital. They were more probably situational, or like everybody has times that they feel low. But I had these extreme manic episodes, which people were concerned enough about that they urged me or forced me into a hospitalization situation.
Right. So people, just so that I'm completely clear, so a person is either one or the other, bipolar 1
okay.
or bipolar 2. Am I understanding that right?
Let me explain it again. Okay. Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Bipolar 1 is more manic. Okay. Like me, I had 3 manic episodes in a year and a half, but it could be more often for people. It could be, I suppose it could be less often. Bipolar 2 has the ups and downs. So somebody might be manic for a few hours or a few days or longer, and then they get very depressed. And then they go back again to becoming manic and depressed. So it cycles up and down. And maybe that's why they call it 2, because it has both dimensions.
Okay, I understand it perfectly now. And I just wanted to get a firm understanding of that leading into the next thing that I want to talk about, because I know this is going to help a whole lot of people. So I had a friend that was diagnosed with bipolar, and she told me that her doctors told her that it had been brought out by an eating disorder and alcoholism. And then I had another friend that had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder. And she said that the head trauma that she got during a car accident, like, unlocked the mental illness or something. Do these types of things, can they just like lie dormant?
It's a very interesting question, because there's no way to prove, what triggers a manic episode. I had theories about mine at the beginning, especially when I was denying that I had a mental illness. I think that's, in my own case, I think that stress did. Whether I had an underlying bipolar disorder from way, way back before I ever had it manifest, or whether it was a new thing when I had my first episode when I was almost 30 years old. I think that stress can bring it on. And you mentioned a couple of different kinds of stress. I don't know. Like I said, there's no way to know because we can't do a controlled experiment.
Right. Yeah, I've always been curious about that. That makes sense though, because stress causes all sorts of things.
Right.
I mean, chronic stress is a real killer. And so that makes a lot of sense to me now. And it didn't when they talked about that, several years ago. I just really couldn't get my head wrapped around that. So I appreciate you explaining that for me. So
Something else you said is interesting about your friend who thought that alcoholism somehow triggered
yes,
the bipolar. A lot of people, it's extremely common now for people who do have some sort of a mental illness or anxiety, depression, uh, whatever, to treat it with alcohol
she was a
or
self
some other drug.
medicator. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
So the person may very well have been treating her disorder
Mm-hmm.
with alcohol
That makes sense.
rather than getting help from a mental health professional.
Right, right. Now that makes total sense. I mean, just thinking back, that makes sense. So I want to talk about some of the things that stood out to me in your book. And like I said, I haven't made my way all the way through it, but it is incredible. I've never read anything quite like it. And your writing style, I mean, you take a really, topic that could go in a really deep, dark direction, but somehow or another, you throw humor in there, and it's a fascinating story. In chapter 4, you talk about, and this was before your diagnosis, you talk about being awake for several days, but you said that you felt fine, and that caught my attention because one sleepless night with me will make me feel just terrible. It's like last night my little dog kept me up all night, and I don't feel like myself. I just want you to elaborate on that. That's fascinating to me. So what did you mean that you felt fine?
I felt brilliant. I had so many ideas and some very happy thoughts. I was convinced that I was going to marry my therapist, that he was in love with me. I
Yes.
had found out not long before that he was getting divorced. So that was my big fantasy, and I was full of gratitude to all these people who had been helpful to me in my life, especially uh, my mentor who taught me how to be a family therapist and a couple therapist, who I'm still grateful to. Her name is Carmen Lynch. May she rest in peace. Unfortunately, she passed away. And I had lots of ideas. It's funny because one of my ideas was that I was going to start an agency to serve families, to make everybody happy and get along great. And in fact, some years later, I became the executive director of a family service agency.
Wow.
So some of it was like these are ideas that were good and actually
Right.
bore fruit.
Yeah.
I didn't marry my therapist though.
Right, right. And in the book, that's Alan.
Yes,
Yes, yes. You felt brilliant because that was the mania, right?
yes,
Okay,
yes.
okay, okay. Now I understand. And physically, you felt fine.
Oh, I was fine physically. And you mentioned that with your dog keeping you up at night, and I can really relate to that. We keep our dog on the other side of the house so that we don't hear her if she decides to bark at something. But anyway, about the not sleeping now, I don't want it. I don't want. Well, I think in the back of my head, I think, well, if I don't sleep, maybe I'm going to have a manic episode because this happened a long time ago.
Hmm.
Although you haven't gotten to the some of the good parts of the book yet, but I, I don't like to give it away too much. But
Sure.
uh, I haven't had a manic. I'm really not bipolar anymore, as far as I know. I've been off medication like for over 30 years and have not had any issues. But it's still like PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder. Things can happen, and it might be like I'm having this something like a flashback of, oh no, if I don't sleep, anything could happen. So
Hmm.
I don't recommend people who have bipolar to, I think it is a very good idea to be very careful to take care of your health in all the dimensions, including sleep, nutrition, exercise. keeping good self-care going on. Yeah, the lack of sleep is definitely a characteristic of the mania, staying up.
Well, I'm glad we went over that.
And your mind just keeps racing.
Yeah. So that's probably a defining factor of a manic episode, is the racing thoughts and
Yes.
the sleeplessness and the delusions, all of that.
Even maybe hallucinations. I thought I sometimes heard somebody talking to me.
Mm-hmm. So
Not a whole lot of that, though, so I don't know if that's characteristic or not.
Right. So you said something just a second ago that threw me a total curveball. So you aren't bipolar anymore. I've always been under the impression it was something that you had for life.
Many people are, probably including most medical professionals. I think people may not talk about it, but I know of a couple of people that I heard about who also, one I actually heard him say it, that I was at a conference and somebody for some reason stood up and told us that he had been, back then it was called manic depression, but he wasn't anymore. And somebody else told me she had a friend whose daughter had it and now no longer has it. And I have read a research paper saying that a sizable percentage of people do recover. Most people do not. Okay, so I would not recommend that anybody do anything different with their medication without the advice and strong recommendation and monitoring by a medical professional.
Sure.
Because I've seen the consequences when people go off their medication and they're not good.
Oh, no, absolutely not. I've seen that firsthand. When someone tells you over and over again that you can't have what you want, you believe it. And those beliefs, unless they are interrupted, have the power to destroy your life. This book takes you on a journey of self-assessment, self-reflection, and self-empowerment, but it's not a quick fix. It's a playbook to a better life. And if you emulate my spiritual teachings, your life won't look the same 1 year from now. I want you to know that if you want something, you're meant to have it. That burning desire that you've always had is there for a reason. Your intuition tells you that you are supposed to do whatever you want to do, and that's why the burning desire never goes away. You may have shut it out a time or two in your lifetime, but it always comes back. Together, we're going to bring that burning desire to life. You can attract whatever you want, regardless of your past and present circumstances. When we're done with your spiritual transformation, those who have treated you badly will wish they hadn't. Miracles aren't reserved for the saints. We sinners are just as entitled to miracles, so let's go get yours. The relationships that I was in with the people that I knew that had been diagnosed with bipolar, and unfortunately, those relationships had to end. And they all, had different characteristics, but very similar because they would not take their medication.
Right.
They just wouldn't. And they would, be rolling along just fine, and then they would stop taking their meds, and it was a very noticeable change in their behaviors. I mean, I saw some disturbing stuff go on with them, and I could always tell when they weren't taking their medication. And heaven forbid that anybody say anything about it, because then that caused them to get very, very defensive. And all three of those people were the exact same way in that aspect.
Very sad when that happens. And I worked in a psychiatric hospital after the alcoholism treatment center, and for me, it was a great reinforcement to keep taking my medication, because we called it the revolving door. People would become treated, they'd get on medication, they'd get stabilized, and then they would leave, and then many of them came back repeatedly because they'd go off their medication and then they'd have to be treated again.
Right. I guess when you're on the medication, you just feel like you're fine and that you don't need it, right?
Well, everything was fine when I
Mm-hmm.
was on the medication. I did well on my jobs. I advanced in my career. The problem with the medication for the people, probably most of the people who stopped taking it, um, I'd say, okay, maybe it's the inconvenience of having to take it, but we might still take our vitamins and various other things. But it's a lot of medications have side effects, and I
Mm-hmm.
was fortunate that mine was at a dosage where I did not have any problems with it, and it was really saved me, and it did save my. I'm sure it saved my career if I kept getting locked up or hospitalized voluntarily. However, it was.
Right.
I couldn't have done what I've done.
Well, on that note, and I'm not going to give away too much about your book at all, but this is a book everybody needs to read because mental illness is very prevalent and a lot of people aren't diagnosed and they don't know what's wrong, they don't know what's going on, and the people around them don't know what's going on. And so that's why I designed these questions the way that I did. I was keeping our listeners in mind. There's a part of your book, and it was in 1974, and you were at the Booth Memorial Hospital in Queens, New York, and your dad and your friend Amy came to visit you. And you were telling them that your placement in a psychiatric hospital before that was a mistake. And so at that point, did you really feel like that it was a mistake? Because when I read that, I'm just really curious because like I rely on my intuition for just about everything, and just I mean my body, and I mean I know when something's wrong. If you really thought there wasn't anything wrong, your intuition must have been just completely non-existent. So I would just like to talk about that for a moment to give people insight so they can step into your shoes, who's someone who really went through this.
Yeah. So it was all so new for me. And I had been doing well in life overall. And I was blaming my mother for getting me hospitalized because I had been behaving in a way where it had become frightening to her. And she must have called the police, and because of the ambulance, police that came, and I was taken to Booth Memorial was a good place. That was the rehab. Before that, the place I was taken to was a locked psychiatric ward that was what they call a snake pit. It was horrible. People were heavily medicated on Thorazine or whatever very strong antipsychotic drugs were. So people were shuffling around in like a semi-conscious state. So I felt like I was a victim of this horrible thing that happened to me, and I blamed my mother, of blessed memory,
Mm-hmm.
for quite a while. I blamed her until I had my second hospitalization when she was nowhere around.
Right. Yeah, my friend that was diagnosed, she lashed out at all of us. You know, all of us. Anybody around her that she cared about, or, you know, that cared about her, we were like punching bags. And that was part of the behavior that I just couldn't get my head wrapped around. I was a lot younger, too. I mean, you know, we're talking, this was a pretty long time ago. And that's another reason I wanted you to talk about that, because she felt the exact same way. And I want to get into this too for just a moment, because this is something I've always had trouble understanding. So the relationships that I had with those three people, at one point or another, they were downright evil, and they were so mean to me at times that I just could not justify being in the relationships anymore, and that's why those relationships ended. And I mean, I can't really say that I did a great job with terminating those relationships, because I didn't know what to do to give them the support that they needed. I just knew that it was hurting me in a big way, and that meanness would just, God Almighty, It would come out of nowhere, and it always caught me off guard. No matter how many times it happened, I was always surprised by it. I often wondered if they hated me for whatever reason, because people will show you how they feel about you, and that's why I would like to have your take on this. Where does this meanness come from, and why did they act like that?
I can't speak for them because there could be various factors involved. I can speak for myself that mostly I was not mean, but I had become really, really angry. At it kind of kept escalating. I was staying at my mother's house, and I was finding her intrusive, and I was holding it back and holding it back and holding it back, and finally I did explode, and that's also described in my book, The Bipolar Therapist, how I ended up running out into the street and screaming, and that was when the ambulance arrived.
Wow. If someone suspects that they are bipolar, what should they do?
Well, first of all, it's very easy when you start reading about different conditions to imagine I have this, I have that.
Oh yeah, especially with social media. I mean, you can diagnose yourself with 5,000 things in a day.
Yeah, I don't know. This is just my intuition says that if they suspect they're bipolar, they're probably not, because in my experience, in the alcoholism treatment center. I learned a lot about alcoholism. I worked there for over 5 years. And one of the expressions in AA is denial. Denial is not just a river in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are bipolar, you're more likely to be denying it if you haven't had at least one big episode. But if you're not bipolar, but you suspect that you might be, I'm guessing you're really not.
Okay.
That sentence may not make sense, but
no, it does.
Yeah. Okay.
Because when you're in the mania and you're having a manic episode, it's not like you're thinking with logic.
That's right. Yeah, you're having fun for a while anyway.
Right.
Till the consequences start out, or you can. There are times when it becomes frightening. I don't have a clear memory of how that was, but I think there were times that it might have been frightening, but mostly it was very exciting and exuberant.
Mm-hmm. That is fascinating. Do you think that it's possible for a bipolar person to function in society, like healthily, without medication?
Well, if they're bipolar like I was, you have your periods, so you could call it remission, like the year between my first and second hospitalization where I was seeing clients, and then another 6 months I was fine after the second hospitalization. And so I'd say in between episodes, and it probably depends also on what field of work you're in, but you can function. But certainly it could get in your way. It could definitely get in your way, because as an employer, I would be thinking, you never know when this person is going to blow again,
mm-hmm.
and what the consequences might be. So it's much, much better to take medication. And if there are side effects that are troubling, to talk to your physician about that, and if necessary, experiment with different drugs or different combinations until you find the one that is really a good fit for you.
Right. It would be, I think, a real transformational time if enough awareness and education were provided on this topic to make it so of the norm. No different than if you get a head cold or you get COVID or whatever, and you go to the doctor and you treat that. Something goes wrong with your body, you break a bone, you go to the emergency room and they put a cast on it and you get that fixed. But for whatever reason, when it comes to mental health issues, that stigma is there, and people are embarrassed. And they shouldn't be.
Yeah, the stigma is terrible. people are frightened. They don't understand it, and they want to push it away. And there's the stigma, and it's very sad. I would agree with you that it would be such a much better world if people gave people with a mental illness the same kind of respect and compassion and understanding that they're likely to give to somebody with a physical illness.
That's right. And it would also help us to have more effective communication with people who are struggling with a mental illness instead of judging. It's like if we could all be educated and informed, that way we wouldn't judge as much, and that brings on the compassion and the empathy. Because looking back to, over 2 decades ago, when I was in those relationships with those people, I probably wasn't as compassionate as I would have been now, because I know more. Mm-hmm. And it's more accepting to me. I mean, it was foreign to me. Like I said, no one talked about mental illness, and that's really kind of scary. It's scary and it's disappointing. I love this conversation we're having, because when people listen, we're working together right now to create an awareness with maybe a whole, different group of people. So my next question is, what typically happens when a person goes undiagnosed? Have you observed any certain behavioral patterns, or is everyone kind of different?
Well, I've observed the mania.
The mania, yeah.
Yeah, the mania, and it just keeps going, and they do their manic stuff, mm-hmm. and it turns a lot of people off, because can't really have a conversation, or kind of a logical conversation with people, because, as you mentioned, it's not logical, mm-hmm. and they're very on top of the world, but not very sensitive to what's going on with the people around them.
Right. And those episodes are pretty unpredictable, would you say?
Yes.
Yeah, based on my experience, that's what I observed. I just want to ask you a couple more things, so I've got you here with our last few minutes together. So in my line of work, and I think about this a lot, I help people understand conscious creation and how to make it work for them instead of against them. How does this work, do you think, when you have bipolar disorder? Do you think that people ever consciously create things that they don't want when they are in those manic episodes?
Well, they're not consciously wanting to turn off people, but that's what happens.
Okay, that makes sense. But then it goes back to what you said earlier. That's, great creativity came out of some of your manic episodes, Yeah. So
the conscious creativity might fit in there. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about it. Like during my 3rd manic episode, I thought that I was going to marry my then boyfriend, who was not anywhere near proposing to me. But I told him that I wanted to get a dog. We were going to get married, and could we have a dog? I really want a dog. I was going on and on about the dog. And eventually I did get my dog. I got married, but not to him.
Right.
So I, just like I mentioned earlier, the family service agency idea, and that also manifested later. So maybe there is this element of well, for me, it was probably unconscious creativity.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in order to, attract people, places, and things that we want, we really do have to brainwash ourselves to a certain extent to trick ourselves into believing that we have something when we don't. And I've done that a lot, and it requires a certain level of delusion. I had to ask you that question to see what you thought about that, because it definitely ties into it. Even if you are operating, you're not conscious of what you're doing. If you're in a manic episode, you're still thinking, you're still feeling, you're still doing, you're still talking. You're, creating an energy and you're attracting things to you, and it could be things you want and things you don't want. And so I'm always very careful with my clients that I coach, because I always think, am I giving somebody, the wrong advice if they're not being forthcoming about maybe any mental health issues they may have? And that's just something that always stays in the forefront of my mind, really.
That's smart to be thinking about that. And
I try to keep an awareness,
and to know when it might be time to suggest that they get a different kind of professional help for a different issue than what they're bringing to you.
Exactly. When someone tells you over and over again that you can't have what you want, you believe it. And those beliefs, unless they are interrupted, have the power to destroy your life. This book takes you on a journey of self-assessment, self-reflection, and self-empowerment, but it's not a quick fix. It's a playbook to a better life. And if you emulate my spiritual teachings, your life won't look the same 1 year from now. I want you to know that if you want something, you're meant to have it. That burning desire that you've always had is there for a reason. Your intuition tells you that you are supposed to do whatever you want to do, and that's why the burning desire never goes away. You may have shut it out a time or two in your lifetime, but it always comes back. Together, we're going to bring that burning desire to life. You can attract whatever you want, regardless of your past and present circumstances. When we're done with your spiritual transformation, those who have treated you badly will wish they hadn't. Miracles aren't reserved for the saints. We sinners are just as entitled to miracles, so let's go get yours. What encouragement can you offer someone who is struggling with mental illness, and are there best practices that they should integrate into their daily lives that will help them to sustain a high quality of life? Because you are someone who's done that. Maybe you could share some of your best practices.
Well, the simple answer is to keep taking your medication and stay on top of it. If you think it might need some kind of modification, to bring that up with the medical professional. Don't experiment on your own, please. And the more, from my mind, the more profound advice is to not let your diagnosis define you, and know that you can take care of that. And in the meantime, you have many gifts and talents that you can contribute to the world. And if people are judging you for having a mental illness, that's their issue. It's not yours. Mm-hmm. Don't take it personally.
They're going to judge us anyway.
One way or the other.
One way or the other. Yeah. Because everybody's going to see us through their perception anyway.
Yeah. And a way, this might be a stretch, but to have compassion for those people, because they have their issues too, and they may not be dealing with them, and then they can project them onto you.
Right. Yeah. That's why I wanted to highlight the experiences that I had in those relationships during those times when that just so mean. I mean, just horrible, saying horrible things, and it was difficult. It was very difficult, and that's why I wanted to highlight that and talk to you about that, because if I went through it, I know other people are too, and they probably don't know what to do either.
Yeah, it's very hard can be very hard to muster compassion for somebody who's trashing you.
Yes. Yeah.
This can be very hard. And I wouldn't blame anybody for distancing themselves if they can't handle it. You can only handle so much.
Sure. And we have to take care of our own mental health too.
That's
so, yeah. Well, this has been enlightening, and I would look so forward to talking to you. And I just want to let our listeners know, because I mentioned earlier, you've written several books. You've written 3? Is that right? 3
That's
books.
right. Yeah, yeah. I have them all right on my desk here.
Yeah, well, why don't we talk about those for just a minute and you can tell everybody where they're available for purchase? I know, let's see. So, one of your books is Marriage Meetings for Lasting Love, 30 minutes a week to the relationship
I
you've
think it's
always
showing up
wanted.
to you on the screen, but yeah, it's here.
There's that one. Oh, I like that cover.
Yeah, it's a good one. Uh, and the other one, there's a poster of it here. Can you see it?
Oh, yeah, I
There's
can see it.
yeah,
Marriage Minded and A to Z Dating Guide for Lasting Love. Is that the
yeah.
one? Yeah.
The first one, Marriage Meetings for Lasting Love, teaches couples how to have a weekly meeting that has a simple agenda and good communication skills explained in the book and guidelines for the meetings. And I can tell you from personal experience, they are very good to do because my husband and I have been doing it for about 35 years,
Mm-hmm.
every week, just about. And it helps people connect in a good way every week, dealing with um, issues that come up, but also taking care of the business of marriage, like hand coordinating chores, and probably the most important part of the meeting, or at least a very important part of the meeting, if not the most, is the part where you express appreciation for each other.
Mm-hmm. That would be definitely beneficial because men and women are so different. It's like we don't process information the same. I mean, my husband's sitting back here. We will have a conversation and then the next day revisit the conversation. And what I heard is not remotely similar to what he heard. And it's like, and then you talked about the coordination of chores. Yeah, that's definitely going to be beneficial for a married couple. So, do you see people virtually as well as in person? Because I know you're in California, right?
Yes, I see people virtually as well as in person.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And one thing I wanted to add about the meeting that there's the 4 parts. So there's appreciation and there's chores. And the part I didn't mention yet is planning good times together, especially a weekly date for just the 2 of you to have a nice time. And then the 4th part is dealing with issues.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny that you say that. Your timing is kind of impeccable because I told Will, my husband, yesterday, I'm like, we need to plan something tomorrow evening, just you and I, because we have been focusing on nothing but work. I mean, for days and days and days. And so we've got a little date planned this evening.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we do make an effort to do those things as often as possible, but it's good you just pointing it out because we always need a reminder and it just needs to, stay in our awareness that we need to keep up with those 4 things. Where is the best place for people to find you? Would that be on your website?
Yeah, I think so. That's a good place. It's you can go to Marriage Meetings with an S on the end, marriagemeetings.com.
Okay. And so all of this information will be linked with our episode
Right.
so people can easily find you.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the books are everywhere. Amazon, Barnes and Noble online, and bookshop.org to support the independent bookstores. And I
Okay.
hope at your library. It's great to ask for it if they don't have it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Naomi. This has been awesome. And I know that we're going to help a ton of people. A lot of great information came out of this. And I so appreciate you being on the show. And it was great to meet you. And maybe one day we'll get to meet face to face in person, not over a computer
I would
screen.
love that.
I would
Yeah,
too. I would
thank you
too.
so much and for having me on
Absolutely.
your show. And it's really been a pleasure.
The Thought Snob Podcast with Paula Swope has been brought to you by Thought Snob Media in association with Special Purpose Studios. All production, mixing, and sound engineering by me, Will Swope. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast. Please take a few seconds to give us 5 stars and leave a review. See you on the next Thought Snob Podcast with Paula Swope.